Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you are tuning in from today. But welcome to today's Insight Report 2023-2024 webinar. Before we get going, I'll just run through a few details for today. As this is a live feed, please do send any questions you have for today to myself or my fellow speakers. And we'll do our best to get back to those questions in our Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we don't get back to you in time today, then and we can't get a chance to get to your questions, then we'll certainly pick up those questions and come back to you separately after the webinar is finished. And I say you might be joining us via the webinar, or you could be joining us via the LinkedIn feed. So again, thank you, and please do send any questions you have into through the system. And for those, the system is now live, so the the report is now available to download. If you visit coxautoinc.eu, that's Cox Auto Inc. EU, and you'll be able to download the relevant details from the website there. And also, please, if you are going to share anything on social media through any of your media channels, then if possible, if you do include Cox Automotive Europe in any post, that would be very much appreciated. And if you can use the hashtag Insight Report 2023, that would again help us track what's happening out there. And please let me now introduce you to today's speakers. So I've got the pleasure of being joined today by Dr. Maureen Paul. Good morning, Maureen.
Good morning. So yes, Dr. Maureen Paul, and I'm an Economic Consulting Director at Grant Thornton, specializing in the energy sector.
And Owen.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, it's Owen Edwards. So I'm head of downstream automotive and UK automotive, and I'd just like to say many thanks to Phil and the team for once again allowing Grant Thornton to work with Cox Automotive on this webinar.
And finally, I'm Philip Nothard, Insight Director here at Cox Automotive. I'll be one of your speakers and the host of today's webinar. So I'll just run through the agenda for today to give you an idea of what we're going to be running through and the timings. To say, we'll be having an economic outlook from Dr. Maureen Paul, who'll be sharing some of the thoughts and looks of what's happening in the economy at the minute. Then it'll be back over to myself. I'll give you a high-level overview of what to expect in this year's Insight Report for the future of automotive retail. I'll then hand back over to Owen Edwards from Grant Thornton, who will give you a high-level view and a bit of an insight for 30 minutes on the making sustainability more sustainable. And then finally, it'll be back to myself just to finish off, give you some insight into what to expect and to look for in the forecasts for the new and used market that we've included in this year's Insight Report. And as I say, finally, we'll have a Q&A session at the end there, but please do send your questions in throughout today's webinar if you do have any for myself, Maureen or Owen, and we'll try to get those answered at the end of today's session. So without further ado, I will hand over to Maureen, who will run you through an economic outlook.
Thanks, Philip. So what I'll do is just give you a high-level view, economic outlook. I'll cover GDP, consumer and business confidence, looking at inflation and interest rate, and then give you a bit of an outlook on the labor market. But I would say overall, there are positive signs. There's still a huge amount of uncertainty. So clearly there is still a long way to go where households and businesses feel that the positive changes. So there's still some way to go. Let's start with real GDP. So GDP, as you would know, is the total value of goods and services, finished goods and services produced in an economy. And what it does, it gives you a sense of the health of the economy. Now, the United Kingdom was predicted to go into recession this year, and that hasn't happened. So that's good news. Nevertheless, we've seen real GDP growth of only about 0.4%, but that is moving in the right direction. The improved outlook is reflecting strong global growth, lower energy prices, which was a big factor in driving up inflation, and lower precautionary savings by households. And the fiscal support that was announced in spring has been having the intended positive impact. And that will take me on to consumer confidence, which plays a part in real GDP growth. According to the May Monetary Policy Committee, the Bank of England has projected household spending to increase by 0.75%, and that is for both 2023 and 2024. And possibly what that is being driven by is a real post-tax household income growth of about 1%, and that's for 2023, but also likely to continue into 2024. On the other hand, with business confidence, there is a slight difference here. We see that business confidence really fell quite strongly and went into negative territory. Now, that was for all regions, all sectors, all types of companies showed that sharp fall. Some of the big reasons for that is the weakening weakening confidence is the legacy of very rapid changes in policy that happened last year, for instance. And also there is the issue of the skill gap, as well as wider geopolitical issues that tend to impact on business confidence and the stability that businesses require to make those investment decisions. But what we would expect is the increase in consumer confidence to eventually help with stimulating more business activity. And that takes me on to the issue of inflation, which tends to, blunt consumer activities. We know that currently inflation is running at 6.8%, and it is expected to fall to 5%. But we can see, it is expected to fall. But what we know has happened, it has remained flat, and largely because although food and energy inflation has fallen, at the pumps, the prices have increased. So there is some positive, but not all. But nevertheless, as you can see, it is predicted to fall, reaching the target 2% by 2025. That is the prediction. Now, higher inflation tends to drive up interest rate as lenders pricing the risk of lending, of the fact that inflation is eroding the value of money. Now, the MPC said in September that they expect it to reach a high of 6% and then fall to about just under 5.5% over the next 3 years. So it's still expected to increase and at some stage fall. So again, some positives, some pain, but eventually leading into some positive territory. And I will move on now to the labor market, a bit of a labor market outlook. So what we see is happening in the labor market is unemployment is predicted to improve. And that's at a time when there is an increase in the number of people who are out of work and not looking for work either. So there is that additional strain in terms of the provision of skills. So there's unemployment, but there are some people who have simply exited the labor market. So we see that unemployment rate is expected to rise to 3.9%. And there seems to be also a reduction in retention measures. Although among mid-sized businesses, as we will see later on, they are looking to shore up that side of their activities. And the heat seems to be coming out of the labor market. So you will see that there are increases in wage. So if we move to, so real wage growth, as you can see, has increased. So the annual growth for regular pay was 7.8% in June, between June and August of 2023. And it is one of the highest annual growth rates since comparable records began in 2001. And that is matched then by the fall in the increase in unemployment. And I think that has also, the wage growth has impacted on consumer confidence. And we saw earlier the increase in consumer spending. So it's all very much related. And I will move now to the sector-wise productivity. So what we see is there are two sides to this. So you see that there, in some instances, there has been an increase in productivity growth for some sectors, but some other sectors really suffering in terms of productivity growth. And overall, the UK is about 16% behind other G7 countries in terms of productivity growth. So quite a lot needs to be done. For instance, the output per worker was flat at 0%, no productivity growth on that measurement. On the measurement of output per hour, it was only 0.1%. So clearly quite a lot need to be done. When you think about the labor market, unemployment, there's quite a lot need to be done where productivity is concerned. And I will now just talk a little bit about investment expectations of the mid-size businesses. So investment expectations have improved in almost all aspects, except we see a decline where R&D is concerned. It's not clear why that is the case, but we see a decline there. But as the economic outlook and the stability of the economy improves, we can expect to see the conditions for businesses to do more, to invest more, starting to yield benefits. Now, overall, the OBR forecast business investment to fall in 2023. So including not just mid-market, but across the board, it's expected to fall, but then to see quite a significant growth going forward. And I will move on to the final slide. And this really tells a story of kind of two sides to the labor market. One, businesses are investing, and I just spoke about that, investing in employee well-being, in technology. There's a lot of investment in that space, but they're thinking overall about their workforce. And some of that is thinking about how to increase productivity, and partly that it means replacing people with automation, but you also see the wage growth possibly having an impact with a decline in recruitment, and also less being able to fulfill open roles. So there's two sides, there are different dynamics happening in the labor market, but the labor market is incredibly important for how the economy works, and in terms of having enough money in pockets to push that consumer confidence, to help businesses and complete that circle. And so I will hand back to Phil.
Well, thank you, Maureen. I think there's I think at the minute trying to do those kind of predictions is probably might be even slightly hard or easy. I'm not sure, compared to trying to predict what the new and used car market are doing at the minute. But I think that was a great little overview there. So really do appreciate that. Thank you, Maureen. Okay, well, I'll try and give you a quick, like I say, high-level overview as to what is happening in the retail sector and what to expect from the report this year when we start to look out at some of the changes happening in the automotive retail. I mean, clearly there is a significant amount happening at the minute, whether that is from your rules of origin, which currently comes into effect next year, which will currently impact both the UK and European markets for import and export into those markets, which has an influence on the battery electric vehicle as well, because I think clearly when you start putting a potentially 10% tariff on top of a cost of a battery electric vehicle, and because of the makeup of battery electric vehicles in the percentage share that are in the battery and where those batteries are sourced from, it has a clear impact on terms of where we are heading in terms of that market. There are lots of compliances to overcome around that legislative marketplace, and both the retailers and the OEMs are clearly trying at the minute to get around what is happening, whether that is the deadlines around the 2030, 2035 deadlines. But, you know, I think clearly we're trying to highlight that the automotive sector is obviously facing significant challenges in obviously complying with this evolving legislative requirements, and especially, as I said earlier, around the electric vehicle market. Now, even when you start to move a little bit away from that rules of origin, and we clearly talked a lot recently around the ZEV mandate, which is the zero electric vehicle marketplace. So, you know, the government's push for the 2030 back to 2035, and subsequently the opposition saying that they will reverse the 2035 back to 2030 in the UK. Clearly, when you've got the ZEV mandate, which sits behind this for cars and for LCVs, that the 30 to 35 will make very little impact on the way the market moves on this transition to battery electric vehicles, particularly when for cars by 2030, it's 80% of new vehicles will need to be battery electric vehicle registered in the UK, and 70% for the commercial vehicle market. So it leaves you very little choice after 2030 of non-battery electric vehicles to choose from. So it's trying to, as we transition towards this zero mandate, there is a lot of nuances starting to play out. And alongside all of this, without going too far back into the pandemic, clearly omni-channel and the changes and change of behaviour and the digital evolution that happened through the pandemic and subsequently after that is changing the way the retailers, OEMs, and the consumers interact with each other in this new retail landscape. And it's working through that approach between automotive retail and blending both the physical and virtual elements of the interaction into a seamless process for the consumer, and one that works for both the OEM and the retailer, inevitably out of the end of it. So within the report, we do take quite a bit of a deeper dive into some of the changes around some of these regulations and legislative changes, the shift towards battery electric vehicles for the retail market, and obviously the omni-channel space. And also, we think about what's happening and adopting the future around EV. You know, the transformation of the role of the dealer, and we know that clearly in the last 5 years, significant changes have been taking place in the retailer, whether that's around the environment, whether that's technology advancements and consumer preferences. But clearly, you know, dealers are facing a profound amount of change in their role due to things like the agency model, and that's been talked a lot recently of the early adopters and moves towards this agency model. And whether that is true agency, whether it is a hybrid between the franchise agreement and the new agency kind of process, and where the retailers sit within that marketplace. And you know, we know that there's some already gone into agency, and we know that the others have it on their agenda to transition towards the agency model. And this is when we start to consider, you know, what is going to be the impact on profitability, on margin retention between the OEM and the retailer, how this looks in terms of the consumer, what will the consumer experience be when they walk into a retailer or they are online in the digital space with the OEM or the retailer in this new landscape. But we know we look at what the financial impact will be from agency, which is still unclear what the true impact will be of on the retailers' profitability on this transition to agency. As I say, there's a lot more of the hybrid models starting to emerge as OEMs actually become clearly apparent of the work and the requirement from the retailer in where they play in that space between them and the consumer. But I think there's obviously a point where dealers have got the opportunity where they can free up some of their resource and invest in other areas in their businesses, in whether that is through implementation of the omnichannel initiatives, etc., or retailers start to do more in the used vehicle space as the OEMs take a lot more ownership in the new vehicle space. But clearly at the end of this, that there is a closer working relationship, whether that's under full agency, whether that is under a hybrid type agreement of agency, or in the current franchise space, where there's a lot of working out of these strategies between the retailer and the OEM, which still need to be clearly defined and worked through. And I think 2024 is going to be a significant year when we start to move through some of these transitions and changes. And that's alongside what I was talking about on the previous slide, where the OEMs and the retailers are trying to transition to a more omni-channel proposition. We've got the ZEV mandate, as I mentioned, the rules of origin. We've got this transition to battery electric vehicles. It's changing the makeup of that new vehicle marketplace, and at the same time the used vehicle market as well. So there's a lot to be defined as we close out 2023 and move into 2024. And that's alongside things like the new entrants coming into the market, where that's the MG as they continue to expand their market share in the UK and Europe and other marketplaces. Clearly BYD and Great Wall are two other significant brands that are moving very quickly into the UK and the European market slightly differently, because they're working on a more NSC partnership with the retailer model. And that's where we see this shift in terms of this partnerships between retailers and OEMs, where some of them don't necessarily want to move into a full agency model space. They don't feel that it's the right move for them, either financially or otherwise. And they start to look at some of these new emerging brands entering the UK and European market. So clearly there's a lot to as we move out of, as I said earlier, out of 2023 into 2024. But one thing it is crucial that successfully we navigate through these transitions and maintain a clear focus onto where we are heading. And finally, from me, as I say, the used car landscape on the back of all what's happening in the new car market is changing. We know the volume of new cars that we lost out of production through the pandemic. Globally, that was 42 million over the 3-year period, about 2.5 million solely for the UK, and a significant loss for the European market. And we always talk about the impact, what that has on the used vehicle part going forward. Year 1, year 2, year 3, and as we head into the year 4 now, we're seeing this continued compound effect from this loss of production. So used vehicle supply has been significantly hindered permanently for the future. And in addition to that, the landscape and the makeup of the fuel types of vehicles in that used vehicle park is changing, and consumer behaviors are changing, with those that are wanting to maybe transition to hybrid, transition to full battery electric vehicle, or things like the ULEZ in certain postcode territories that is forcing change for the consumer and businesses as well. But clearly the demands and the changes have started to occur. this transition between the virtual and physical landscape isn't just defined to new, it is for the used vehicle as well. And that's in both retail and in the wholesale market. The way vendors look to through their channels of disposal has significantly changed as well. And clearly, we're not going to return to pre-pandemic marketplaces either for the new or the used vehicle market. The market has shifted. We start to see where there are things coming out of the OEM, whether that's things like Spoticar from Stellantis, starting to how they proposition their used vehicle market across their dealer network to the consumer, where that is UK expansion into Europe. And now we start to see people such as Spoticar going into the US market as that brand proposition for their used vehicle market to the consumer. But clearly, there is from a dealer perspective and manufacturers are looking closely at where that relationship is between that new and used, and whether that is under the franchise or agency model for the future. We know that there are manufacturers, OEMs, exploring the opportunity of entering the agency proposition in the used vehicle space, because when you start looking at a consumer, when they're dealing with the OEM in the new vehicle space, but actually they might want to look at a nearly new car, 12-month-old, 24-month-old vehicle. How does that work when the retailer is dealing with the used vehicle, but for the new vehicle that they're also comparing with is ready to compare the two? So, and clearly what we're trying to look at within this year's report is some of these changes and how we start to consider. But for now, I will leave it there and say there's a lot more in the report itself, and I will hand over to Owen, who will talk you through the making sustainability more sustainable.
Thanks, Phil. So this is around sustainability, more sustainable, which is clearly not very easy to say after you've had a few drinks. But fundamentally, what I want to do really briefly at this point is take you through what we're going to go through in this area. Now, clearly, Phil has already said there's a lot of change, and there is a lot of change taking place for what Phil classifies as the dealer groups, but also as well for the manufacturers. And this is the section that highlights what's really the changes that are taken for the manufacturers. So the areas that we're going to cover is after what we call after the gold rush, and you'll find this in the insight report. And that's really where is the BEV market at the current point in time. Then we're going to go on to the unstoppable rise of EVs. And so that really highlights where are BEVs going, and also alternative fuels as well, which is a very interesting topic. And then also as well, the supply chain and what's really happening to the supply chain to the OEMs as well. So let's have a look at that after the gold rush, battery evolution. Now, battery electric vehicles have been around for many years. We know that, but fundamentally the technology has really changed quite a lot over the last 5 to 10 years since we've sort of seen the first Tesla Roadster, really. And what we've seen in the way of battery technology is the chemistry itself has changed. And that's one of the key important things that's taken place out there. So we've moved from what's known as NMC batteries, which is nickel, magnesium, cobalt batteries, still got lithium in them, onto lithium sulfate batteries, LFP batteries. But what we're going to start to see going forward as well is things such as solid state batteries, where you could get up to 600 miles out of those batteries on one charge. That's pretty significant. And then possibly lithium air batteries, which is sort of the frontier of maybe 2040, 2045. And those type of batteries will really give you one charge up to, some people are saying up to 1,000 miles. So it's quite substantial. But don't just think it's the chemistry that causes the benefits, how you also construct the battery as well. So as you're probably well aware, the likes of Tesla will fill their batteries or their battery modules, this is what sits within the car, with tiny little batteries that are only 21 millimeters long and wide. But those batteries are circular, much like the Duracell ones which you have at home that you put in your remote control. Now, the problem with that is you can pack them more densely if you also do them and pack them in a different way, i.e. you put them flat and long in a different shape of battery. That gives you more battery construct. And with that, gives you, again, more power density and more output for the vehicle. And of course, that then has an impact on the market. So the sort of areas that it has an impact on the market is the following: lower costs, as you would expect. Can we go back one, Phil, please? Sorry, lower cost. So lower cost is really around bringing the chemistry down, using less of cobalt, for example, which is very expensive, and then also a greater safety with LFP, so less what we call thermal runaway, high explosivity of the battery, and then a greater power density, which gives you less charge, more power, and again, a longer run on that one particular battery. So what we see is that the OEMs now need to consider the full life of the battery. And one thing that we're going to look at on the next slide is the full life and the circle of that battery. So we're looking here at the sustainability of the battery market. So what needs to happen in the battery market is we need to have a sustainable resource that can be used not now, but also in the future as well. And so that reliable source really needs to come from mining at the moment, which again is not the most ethical side of things. But fundamentally, that is giving us a good supply of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and other battery resources that we actually need. Now, with that, we also need to consider not just that resource and supply chain on that resource, but also the ethics of that resource. So at the moment, for example, cobalt is one of those areas where, the cobalt itself, when it's mined, comes out of places such as the Congo. Now, there's question marks over the ethics of how that's mined from those areas, which we won't touch on today, but clearly that needs to be accounted for. So in the way of reliability and source and ethics sources, what we can do is we can fundamentally track that by using battery passports. And one of those companies that does that, for example, is Volvo with their battery electric EV passports. And they're now doing that already. So they can see it from the mine right the way through to the car, and from the car right out to the recycling. And of course, one of the areas that we can get a reliable resource from is from recycling. And so recycling can be done in many ways. We can recycle the batteries. We can do it through hydrometallurgy, which is basically a chemical breakdown of the battery, or we can do it through pyrometallurgy, which is again heating the battery up, burning off the bits that we don't want, and being left with the raw materials, which are very valuable at the current moment in time. We can take it the other way, which is basically take it out of the car, strip the battery down, and then develop it into battery storage, which is what you're slowly starting to see to get grid balancing in America, which is very helpful. So that's an alternative use. At the moment, battery repairs are very limited because at the moment there is the batteries are enclosed, they're welded shut basically, but sooner or later we will start to see further repairs of these batteries taking place and the length of cars extending due to that ability to do the repairs. So and fundamentally, what we're now starting to see is that the OEMs have to maintain sustainability. Now, on that level of sustainability, we can now go on to the next set of slides, which is really around the BEV and the global growth. So what we've seen, we'll give you a few stats around this. So this is where we are currently. Hybrids and BEVs will account for about 20% of the new car sales by the end of 2023. In the UK, interestingly, at the moment, we're about 16%. But what's driven that in the UK versus the global is clearly legislation, and we will look at that in a minute on what legislation is taking place. Now, the IEA, one of the people we use for our statistics, is suggesting that there's 40 million BEVs on the roads at the moment in 2023. It's not a great deal. There's still significantly more growth. When you think that between 80 and 90 million vehicles are produced a year, that's still quite small. But that will continue to grow. And the reasons for that, as we said, is legislation. What we're seeing, though, the countries that are growing the greatest, China is clearly growing very strongly. We've seen a lot of support there with both the consumer, but also battery electric vehicle companies. And there's over 300 battery electric vehicle manufacturers in China, but also Europe and the UK as well. And we'll come on to European legislation in a minute, because that's very key to advancing where it grows in the future. But combined with that, what we can see is that there's increased or improvements in the lower cost of batteries, and they are coming down. At the current moment in time, we measure everything by kilowatt per hour, and that's dollar per kilowatt per hour. So a Tesla battery and an MC battery is about $135 to $125 per kilowatt hour. That we think will come down by 2026 to somewhere in the region of about $100 per kilowatt hour. Why $100 per kilowatt hour? Because that's broadly parity with where the internal combustion engine cost is. So that gives you an idea of where the battery technology will go. Clearly, we expect it as it goes through to solid state batteries to then become even cheaper. So it could go below the parity of internal combustion engines. Clearly, better battery safety, which you would expect around LFP batteries. And there's also different other types of technology that are coming out at the moment. Again, we talk about solid state batteries, which is a sort of holy grail, or move towards the holy grail. That'll be incredibly safe with limited or no thermal runaway at all. So no explosivity in it to a certain extent. And then, of course, as that comes along, batteries grow. The biggest issue that we've got is the moment price for consumers. We've talked about that with prices coming down. But the next thing that consumers are very concerned about is really around that process of where do I charge? So charging anxiety. Is the charging going to be full of 5 other Teslas or 7 BYD cars? One would hope not. And if so, is the charging working? Is another question mark. And then finally, how long will my range anxiety enable me to travel from A to B? Which again, once you start to do 600 miles in the UK, that's going to dwindle over time. Now, what we said already is what is going to drive this growth. And we talked a bit about legislation. What we can see across the world is legislation is on the increase. Why? The reason for that is really based around COP27, 26 originally, then going on to 2027. And what's happened is the automotive market is one of these markets where you can see the emission, you can test the emission, you can smell the emission, therefore it must be an emission. And therefore, on the back of that, you can then fine it. And you can create legislation around that to reduce that emission. And that's exactly what's happened across many countries. So we're seeing that with CAF in the US. We're seeing with Standard 6 now in China, very strongly in China. And China's already ahead of the game, as they say. We've got Fit for 55 that came out in 2023. And that will mean that zero emissions is taking place for battery electric vehicles. So zero emissions for all vehicles, actually, the passenger cars will take place in 2035. Some countries may in Europe be 2040, depending on how quickly they can get up to that period of zero emissions. And then, of course, we've got, as Phil spoke about earlier, ZEV mandates. Now, this is the zero electric vehicle mandate, and that means by 2035, all battery electric or all vehicles sold in the UK will be battery electric vehicles or zero emitting from the tailpipe. So no longer will we be able to purchase internal combustion engines at that particular point in time. But what, as Phil has said, is Rishi Sunak recently moved that from 2030, where you could up to 2030 purchase internal combustion engines. You can now move that. He's now moved that target to 2035, so you can now purchase internal combustion engines till 2035. Clearly, that makes a difference to the OEMs because they were planning originally to only have hybrids in between 2030 and 2035. So there is a sort of a supply chain issue there for the OEMs, and some OEMs have complained about this. But I think the most important thing is that at some point we get some form of stability on the policy going forward. The chart on the right is a very interesting chart. So that just shows you that in 2018, this is alternative vehicles, fuel vehicles. Now, this is everything. This includes hybrid, hydrogen, and battery, was only 6% in 2018. Look at the massive growth that you've seen to 52.6%. And again, if we looked at pure battery electric vehicles in 2018, again, we would be broadly close to 3%. We're now 16% and growing. And again, that will grow further to next year to 22%. Under the ZEV mandate. So that's the UK. And by 2035, clearly, we won't see any of the dark blue, the petrol or the diesel, because that will be 100% BEV. Now, that's not the only area that we can see support coming from. We can also see support coming from government as well, which is absolutely critical in supporting the consumer to purchase vehicles that are environmentally friendly or zero tailpipe emissions. We've seen that in the UK. We had that in the UK last year. That went to zero, so the government no longer supports that. But what's happened is in Europe, by the way, in the UK, the government is supporting vans and is supporting trucks because they're classified as being a less mature EV market. So there's still support there for those type of products. However, what I would say is Europe is really on top of this very, very well. We're starting to see Germany with €3,000 per vehicle. However, that's dropped from 5, and that dropped from €5,000 in January 2023. So there is also a decline for support from Europe as well. And you're seeing similar sort of factors in France and the other European markets. US with IRA has now introduced tax credits of $7,500 and their lease cars as well. So that has taken off very strongly, driving the market share of EVs in America at a stronger rate than what it historically has. So we are starting to see a really strong powering through of the US market, both through the investment for IRA, battery electric vehicles, battery manufacturing, and the supply chain around battery, as well as the consumer sport. Now, although we have that for the UK, not for the bans and light commercial vehicles, and again Europe, what also needs to be considered, that's for new vehicles, what also needs to be considered is for used vehicles. Now, it is critical that used vehicles are also supported as well, and the understanding of battery electric vehicles is also understood in the used car market. Phil did allude to that a little bit, but I think fundamentally what we have here is, in order to have one vehicle coming off, i.e. off into the used car market, i.e. a new vehicle is sold, and then on top of that a part exchange is given, likely to be in the future a battery electric vehicle, the used car market needs to be understood more for battery electric vehicles and supported. Now, what we are seeing is reasonable amounts of support in Europe, on the Netherlands for €2,000. Germany is broadly £1,000, and France is also £1,000, and that's what's driving basically the used car market. But what I would stress is it's not just batteries that are the only fuel in the market. We need to consider some other fuels, and if we move on to the next slide, we'll see that in itself with the range of fuels that will be out there. So every one of the questions that people ask me is, so battery electric vehicles are the thing, they are the be all and end all. The answer is no, that's not correct. There will be a big proportion of battery electric vehicles out there, but there will be hydrogen and e-fuels. So why will there be a big proportion of BEVs? Very simple. In the world, in Europe, in the UK, there is a large number of passenger cars, and so therefore battery electric vehicle is more supporting the passenger car market, and with that, that's somewhere in the region of 80 to 90 million cars produced a year. That gives the manufacturers good teeth to get their bite into in developing the technology, getting the value for money out of it and the return on investment. And so consequently, once they've got the return on investment from that, they can then flow down into the light commercial vehicle market. For those that don't know, that's the vans and anything that's 3.5 tonne and below, and the light trucks and some heavy goods trucks that are not moving any significant distance. So they're actually short distance vehicles. So therefore, there is the opportunity for those short distance vehicles to be charged up over a period of between 5 and 9 hours if the battery is that large. However, hydrogen, where does that play its position? We believe that hydrogen will, without a doubt, play its position. Much like battery electric vehicles, there is a lack of infrastructure. In fact, there's further lack of infrastructure in hydrogen than there is actually in battery electric vehicles. But fundamentally, the biggest issue is the total cost of ownership for hydrogen, and that fits very, very well with HGVs, heavy goods vehicles, or what in America we call Class 8 trucks. Now, the reason for that is they travel long distance, they need a lot of power. They also take a very, very large amount of weight within those vehicles. So if you're putting a battery in it, you're losing some of your haulage weight. And secondly, it's the dwell time, what we call dwell time. The time that's taken to charge the vehicle up. It's extensive. For battery electric vehicles, it's less so for hydrogen. So therefore, there is the issue that you could, with hydrogen, enable yourself to charge that vehicle up from an empty fuel tank for a fuel cell to between 5 and 10 minutes. Now, you've still got zero emissions, so that's good. Well, the only emission you have is water. The other opportunity to do within that particular area of hydrogen is to have internal combustion engines driven off of hydrogen. The issue with that is it is possible, but the big issue around that is it'll have to be a mixture of hydrogen and some other form of atom as well, or energy. But it also releases carbon into the atmosphere. So it's not really giving you that zero tailpipe emissions, and you would have to have carbon offsets to undertake that. So let's go into e-fuels. Why e-fuels? Well, the reason for e-fuels is this is one way that some of the, let's call them specialist premium vehicles, can reduce their level of CO2 emissions without going down the battery electric vehicle route. We know that Ferrari and Porsche are investing heavily in this particular area. And what it will basically be is it will be a product that you gain, as it says here, from the Fischer-Tropsch process, which is carbon monoxide plus hydrogen combined together with chemistry to make an e-fuel. And from that, you can then burn that like an internal combustion engine burns normal petrol or diesel. Now, the real issue around this is it takes CO2 emissions from the tailpipe, but at the same time, it needs CO2 emissions to create it. So it is not one of the cleanest, and it won't be a zero emitting fuel. But what it will do is you will have to have, again, carbon offsets in order to enable to do that. But we think that's going to be very much a niche market versus, say, for example, BEV, with then hydrogen being the next biggest market, and then finally e-fuels being less. So we've looked at the battery end of the market. What we now need to look at is from batteries going onto the supply chain. And we're looking at a section called chain reaction, which, as I said, is around how the manufacturers are taking their supply chain and developing their supply chain, and why they're doing it. Well, the reason is that supply chain that the manufacturers have is incredibly complex. In fact, it's one of the most complex around. And actually, most of the OEMs, if not all the OEMs, have got their global supply chain very much as efficient as they possibly can. So let me give you an example of that. So if you take Honda, who used to manufacture in the UK, no longer does, sadly, but used to manufacture here, they had 1 hour's worth of inventory to put in their supply chain. So it is very, very short. It is very, very niche, and it moves very, very quickly. And you see this very much with the likes of Toyota, with their Kaizen process. And it's all about keeping those costs to an absolute minimum. Now, the problem that we've seen is with the complexities that take place in those supply chains, when you start to disrupt it through, let's say, in Japan in 2011, there was a tsunami that knocked out paint in the paint generation for paint flakes. That caused great issues. That basically stopped paint production for a couple of days. Or more importantly, COVID-19 has had a dramatic effect on semiconductors, and that in turn has had a major effect, as Phil has said in his part, and is highlighted in the Insight document, around the supply of vehicles. So with that supply around the supply of vehicles, you then need to consider what happens when this disruption takes place. Well, one of the areas around that, and we'll discuss this a little more in a minute, is the change to vertical integration, i.e. you're not just doing the assembly of the vehicle, but what you're looking at is you're looking at your supply chain and saying, how much of that supply chain vertically can I take into my control and my consideration? Why? Well, it improves the margins, and we've seen that with the likes of BYD. We'll come on to BYD in a minute, but also it secures the supply chain. It gives me that comfort, that feeling, that confidence that I can basically know where the individual components are going, and I'm paying for those components as it is, and I'm not letting a third party get involved in that, and the third party is not taking that proportion of the margin. So as it says, it improves the margin as well. However, it also increases my control, which is great, but more importantly, it increases the consistency of the product that is coming through. So I know that I'm not going to get a product that is substandard to where I want to be. So overall, that provides a great deal of comfort and a great deal of vertical integration and movement for me to have. Now, the benefit of that clearly for the likes of Tesla and BYD is the following. The benefit is that they have a limited legacy supply chain already. So they didn't outsource, or they haven't outsourced a large proportion of their supply chain. So they have that in-house. We can see that really clearly with BYD, for example. So work that we've been doing, we indicate that up to 75% of BYD's supply chain is vertically integrated, i.e. they own it. And what that can do actually is that can give them a substantial cost advantage, as you've seen with Tesla. And this is one of the reasons why Tesla, over the last couple of months, has had that consistent price cutting, because yes, it's eroded their margin, but they still have sufficient margin due to the cost structure on their vertical integration to enable them to do that, and in turn gain more market share, which at the end of the year, they believe where they are now is going to be about 1.8 million units. So that's really from maybe 5 to 10 years ago being zero. Now, what we now need to look at is going to the next slide, is looking at what are they doing to secure that. So I think you might have gone on 2 slides there, Phil. So yeah, so what are the OEMs looking to secure their supply chain? So yes, we said vertical integration, and yes, it is an end-to-end process and looking at that level of supply, but we also have to look at the area that Phil was also highlighting, which is the distribution and supply chain. We need to ensure that that the whole end-to-end supply chain is really sewn up and to their advantage. So there is the ownership of the supply chain, and we're seeing this with the raw materials, especially with the raw materials. People are very concerned not getting that battery electric vehicle raw materials. That's the lithium, that's the sodium sulfate, that is whatever that may be, cobalt, for example. So the OEMs, such as Tesla's, Ford, they're investing in these areas. They're partnering or they're buying. And then from that, the likes of Tesla's are then looking at the refinery that refines it. And then they're looking to the battery manufacturing. And then from the battery manufacturing, moving that forward onto the 1 to 4 tier parts providers, as we call them. And then from that onto the OEMs. So, you are starting to see more and more as time goes on, the manufacturers go down that route. But we still have this bit, what's called after the gate. And after the gate is the bit when it comes off the production line. So with Mini, there's a Mini coming off every 65 seconds at Oxford. Yeah, you've got to keep the production going. And that therefore then needs to get out into the market. And so not only do you need to have your supply chain efficient and effective, you've got to have your distribution and retail chain. Now, with that, you've got logistics. Logistics is moving the cars. Now, what they've found in China is a 27.5 million new vehicle market every annum. They've found they've got 3 million vehicles in excess. So they want to get that out of the country and then move that to somewhere else, likely to be Europe. What SAIC, Shanghai Incorporated, has done, that's part of MG, or MG is part of them, is they now have their own roll-on, roll-off boats. They've got one at the moment, putting 4,000 vehicles on and rolling 4,000 off. That will increase anywhere between 9 and 12 vehicles, rolling 9,000 on and 9,000 off. That says to me there's a lot more Chinese vehicles to come, which we can talk about some other point. Now, distribution, the OEMs have, in large markets, always owned distribution, and they control that distribution. In smaller markets or smaller brands, that is left up to the likes of Inchcape, Emil Frey, and the big players like that. But in simple terms, the national sales companies, as we call them, Ford of Britain, you will know of, Mercedes-Benz UK, and also the finance companies that relate to that fund those vehicles and also provide consumer confidence, is then pushing them down that downstream, what we call after the factory gate. And then more and more, as Phil has said, the retailers. So Mercedes-Benz this year has gone into the agency model, and there's more of that definitely in the insight document. And fundamentally, Phil has spoken about that, and more can be seen, as I said. But there's also the likes of Ford with Ford Trust and Stellantis for You, which was the old Robinson Day. So in fundamentals, they are now not only controlling the supply chain, but they are also now starting to control that distribution and gain those economies of scale, gain the security of that, and therefore create a circular economy once they start to also do the refining. Now, what I would say is the thing that is doing that is that's a sustainability of the operation. However, we'll look in the next slide to the sustainability of the environmental sustainability that they're now having to face as well. So what they're having to face in the way of environmental sustainability is, we've already said, the outlook that they need to look at is zero emissions. We know that. Phil has commented on it. I've commented on it. The UK government and governments around the world have commented on it. Zero emissions vehicles, Ford is saying by 2030, all their vehicles will be BEV. Kia has said 2035, and then General Motors and others will follow between 2030 and 2035. So of the tailpipe, they can account for that. But that's only just one step they need to account for. The other then becomes the point they have to be carbon neutral committed. And that really comes around COP27. And that determination really comes around, when will I manufacture my vehicles and send them out into the market with zero carbon neutral? Now, Mercedes-Benz is one of the first into the market with 2039, followed by JLR, and then Volvo 2040. And then following that, the others have come out and said, well, between then and 2050. So they've got this to consider, how they are going to meet their COP targets and how they are going to basically get to that stage of being carbon neutral. Now, of course, we said emissions is already led. We know that. Environmental, social, and corporate governance, ESG, is becoming more and more important. Not only because they have to seem to be doing the right thing legislatively, but also their brand as well. They want to be seen, as I said, to be zero emitting and to be looking after the environment and looking social and corporate governance correct. So there's those 2 points there. Now, what we also then have, of course, is, as I've said, that's what they've got to do. How do we now collect that data, report that data, and then structure that data so they can be tested to get that carbon neutrality? Well, One of the ways of doing it, as we know, is through the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFDs. And there's 3 scopes to this. So just for the automotive, the direct emissions is really around the supply chain. And we've discussed the supply chain already. Indirect emissions is really from the vehicles, the tailpipe. We've discussed that. But the bit we haven't discussed is the downstream. And the downstream is the bit that's going to cause a lot of problems for it, we believe. And that'll be really around, what about the dealers? What about the franchises? What about the recycling plants? What about the people that after the factory gate all have emissions as well? And all that needs to be accounted for and catered for in order to start to report that. And then increasingly as time goes on from 2024 to report that both publicly and to meet those requirements that they've set as a target. We've also got EU's carbon adjustment mechanisms, CBAMs. There's likely to be fees coming in if you don't meet those CO2 emissions on these vehicles, and it'll probably be the production of vehicles. There is that, but there's also the situation as well that what we're starting to see, and Phil highlighted this, I believe, in his commentary around the Chinese are coming. What about if we put a 10% tariff on Chinese vehicles? Well, we can get around that, as we've seen potentially with France and Italy. So rather than a fee on the actual vehicle itself, it'll be a fee on the CO2 emissions of the production of the vehicle. Clearly with Chinese vehicles, they manufacture with what we call brown power, high CO2, and they've got to move it from China to Europe. So therefore, that increases the CO2 emissions. And therefore, rather than putting a fee, France and Italy are now considering not that fee, but we're also considering putting a scenario where they will not support, i.e. you will not get subsidy for battery electric vehicles. So in summary, we covered quite a lot off, I know, but the automotive industry has gone through a large amount of change. In fact, we believe that the change both for what we call the upstream supply chain and the downstream dealers over the last 5 years, there's been more change than the last 50. But the BEVs has been clearly the biggest challenge, and hence we focused on that, and hence we focus on that in this particular sector in the Insight report. The OEMs have stepped up to that challenge. They've done incredibly well. They have invested a huge amount of money and will continue to invest huge amounts of money. And they'll continue to develop and continue to build forward, as we said, with solid state batteries. Regulation is clearly driving this, so the OEMs have to meet that, and they are doing that. Will every target be met? Well, we don't know yet. But fundamentally, they are trying, they are pushing, and they are moving to meet these over greater times. The supply chain, as we said, needs to be absolutely robust. Vertical integration, we're already seeing, and we are going to see more of that, we believe. So what we believe is actually it is exciting times in the automotive supply chain area. There's more to come. There will be more challenges, but we're absolutely certain that the OEMs will confront these head on. And on confronting them head on, we think there's probably, or potentially, even more change to come. But what we say is it's exciting times, and the OEMs will, without a doubt, continue to perform and grow. With that, I will now hand you over to Phil.
Thanks, Owen. I think there's a few questions coming on the battery market, as we probably expected. It's a significant subject that we've tried to cover within the Insight report. Well, I'll just move on to the final section for today, which is the new and used vehicle forecasts. And as with what you've just been hearing from both Maureen, Owen, and myself earlier, trying to forecast what is going to be happening across the new and used vehicle market is becoming ever more challenging. I think clearly that a ancient Greek philosopher once wrote that change is the only constant. No one steps into the same river twice. So when through the sector we constantly get asked, when will we return to normality after the pandemic? Back to the 2019 marketplace. Clearly we won't. With everything that you've just heard from Owen and myself earlier, and what's been happening in the economy over recent years as well, the market has shifted, and it has shifted permanently. And you can see on screen here, just before we move into some of the forecasts, some of the historical data points that we try and look at to gauge some of the influence and impact on the automotive sector, particularly in the UK. When we start to talk about a 95, 96 million production market. Clearly, as you can see there, that is not the norm for the global production. So when we fell to 77 million in the first year of the pandemic, actually that was slightly, only slightly behind the 2-decade average of there that you can see there at 77 million anyway for global production. And you start to think about what happened in the financial crash, when suddenly the money became significantly cheap. Import export was very positive for the marketplaces. Currency was very positive, and there was a significant bounce in production, and high demand for low rate PCP deals. Lots of incentives and for the consumer to shift into a new vehicle. So you can clearly see there that 7-year period as we came out of the financial crash, when we really started to recover. But even before we went into the pandemic, that global production had actually started to slow. It started to ease off, as did new car registrations, and as did used car transactions there. So again, you look at that used car transactional figure, we are not naturally a 8 million used vehicle marketplace, and we're certainly not a 2.6 million new vehicle marketplace on average over the 2-decade period. Those are significantly push marketplaces, not pull. We've seen the benefit of the pull marketplace through the pandemic period, when production was constrained, and we're expecting that we will start to recover. But as we've sort of alluded to throughout this webinar today, there are still significant challenges facing production, changes into the manufacturers in terms of what they produce, what they have to adhere to in terms of regulations and legislative changes. Import and export is clearly a significant change that is on the horizon. And we can't continue to build 96 million vehicles globally and call ourselves a sustainable industry. So the shift is changing. And when we start to look at the UK, in terms of global production, the UK is a fairly low percentage share of global production in isolation to everybody else. We are on average below 3% of global production on average, as you can see through the period. So let's think about what is going to happen going forward, and you'll see within the Insight report, as we've done previously through Insight reports and the quarterly autofocus, we produce our upside, otherwise a best case scenario, our baseline, which is the most likely, and then the downside, which is a worst case scenario. And we're trying to look at where things like what Maureen was talking about right at the start of today's webinar is what will happen in terms of that interest rates, inflation. We know that inflation was pushed in the recovery of inflation was pushed further back, and with the interest rates have been trying to battle against the inflation of the market. We've had things like the cost of living crisis hit the UK and other marketplaces. There's been talk of on the edge of recession for UK and some of the European markets. The market is a very challenging marketplace that we operate within. And to Owen's point that he was making earlier, the UK potentially, if we start to adopt some of these new entrants, whether that's from China, whether that's from Vietnam and other marketplaces, then, we could start to see this acceleration again of new cars, acceleration as consumers start to adopt some of these new entrants vehicles. And that's where we start to think, if we can get hold of the economy, we can get the cost of living crisis under some kind of control, and the vehicle supply comes into the UK and other markets across Europe, then we could see a quicker than normal recovery. However, what we are considering in our forecast is, as we talked to earlier on, this transition to agency does impact, as we've seen already in this year, that it does start to impact that sales and the market share of some of the OEMs that transition to the agency model. There's still a lot for the OEMs to navigate around with the rules of origin, which still isn't fully defined, and there is obviously challenges being placed both from the UK government and the European market that trying to delay the rules of origin. And there's the ZEV mandate, as we touched on earlier, where some OEMs are certainly not in a place to achieve the 22% for 2024 for cars, and I think it's 10% for LCVs. Some are better placed than others. Some of the ZEV mandate has been changed on the back of the pushback of the 2030 to 2035. But clearly, there is a lot to do in 2024 for the OEMs and the retailers to achieve those kind of levels. So we are being fairly realistic for our 2024 forecast, where there is still a significant amount of headwinds that the automotive sector needs to navigate through, and that's before we start to talk about what's happening in the used vehicle market currently. So what does the figures look like? And you'll see within the report we have broken it down by quarter through all the various scenarios, but realistically we do believe that 2024 will be a marginal increase on new vehicle registrations, that's new cars in the UK, to just over the 2 million. The forecast at the minute for the 2023 is around the 1.9 million. So next year we are forecasting a marginal increase, but not to the level that we expect to see this year. That we've seen that push recovery, production increase, heavy incentives, a lot of focus from the OEMs in pushing product into the marketplace after 3 years of stagnation. Lots of support and incentives starting to appear as production starts to recover at a time where consumer demand has eased in the final quarter of the year for the new and used vehicle market. So we are forecasting a marginal recovery in 2024, and then we'll see a bit more of a upward trajectory as we go towards 2025, as we navigate through some of the areas that we've discussed throughout today's webinar. And then if we look at a little bit further out, 5 years time and 10 years time, then we'll probably, in terms of the UK market, get to what we would call more of a normalized market of the 2.3 million new vehicle registrations in the UK. And we don't believe this is dissimilar through Europe. Europe have got various different regional challenges, but again, production is recovering, and some of these European manufacturers are moving quickly into the new entrance manufacturers are moving very quickly into both Europe and the UK, and that's notwithstanding people Latin America and trying to get into the US market as well. And again, for the used vehicle market, lots going on. We've got trying these used vehicles against new, the relationship between new and used. We know already that in the final quarter of this year, there's been a lot of product coming out of the manufacturers into the fleet leasing sector. They've been working through some of their lease and contract extensions, and those have been coming back into the market in volume. That's been putting pressure on used vehicle values as we start to see there. Used vehicle, Owen touched on the battery electric vehicle for the used vehicle sector. We know it was clearly publicised through the industry of what happened with significant oversupply to used battery electric vehicle values when those started to come back into a used vehicle market that wasn't ready for those volumes of used vehicle of electrics starting to enter. So again, there is a lot to consider as we start to think about, again, the best case, most likely, and worst case scenarios when it comes to the used vehicle forecast transactions for 2024, as we start to think about the impact, and we touched on it earlier, the lost volume from productivity. In the UK alone, 2.5 million, and that's at the same time as the market share for petrol and diesel vehicles has also reduced. So not only is the the share of overall vehicles entering the used vehicle marketplace reduced, so have the ICE vehicle product as well, which is still in strong demand as a used vehicle buyer. So we are considering that as we move through 2024 and beyond. So what do the figures look like for 2024? We are forecasting a 7.35 million performance for 2024. That will be a 2.8% increase on what our forecast is for 2023. I think we're still moving in that right direction. We are on a recovery, albeit, as I said earlier, a little bit slower in 2024 as we move forward. I think one thing to consider when we talk about a 7.35 million used vehicle market in 2024, that will actually be just only a 0.3% decrease compared to the 2001 to 2019 average. So it is more in line with what you expect for the UK used vehicle transactional market. And that'll be about a 3.64 to 1 ratio of used to new, which is about where we've been generally over the 2 decades. So not really a, I think I would class a 7.35 million used vehicle performance as being a fairly positive. We have an upside forecast of 7.6 million for next year. So if, like we say, if we can get the economy under control, get inflation and interest rates under control, get that consumer confidence back up again, get the business confidence back up again, and get that relationship between new and used at the same time as trying to get this adoption to the used vehicle, battery electric vehicle market moving, then we could move up above that 7.3 million in 2024 and more closer to the 7.5, 7.6 million market. And looking a little bit further out there, as you can see on screen, 2025, we do expect the baseline to be at least 7.5 million, and then a little bit further out, getting closer to the 8 million used vehicle transaction market as things start to stabilize, used vehicle park starts to recover, the transition to that battery electric vehicle alternative fuel market starts to transition, and values become a little bit more stabilized. Because we haven't really got time to go into values today. But obviously there's when you start to look at used vehicle values today compared to where they were in a pre-pandemic marketplace, although they have been falling over recent months, they're still significantly higher than you'd expect to see those vehicles in a pre-pandemic. So, the used vehicle markets, although are falling, they are still significantly higher where they were previously. So like I say, there's a lot more detail in the Insight report, a lot more context around some of the upside, baseline and downside scenarios that you can take a look at. And if you need any more seasonal details of some of these forecasts, then please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I'll certainly arrange a conversation around that. So hopefully you've found today useful. Hopefully we've given you a high-level view of some of the insight within the report this year. We obviously haven't got time to cover everything, and the market is significantly facing significant change, whether that's through the economy, through the supply chain, transition to new legislations and regulations, and the supply and demand marketplace happening for the new and used vehicle market, both cars and for LCV. So what we want to just finish on at the minute is, let's say, you can download the full report now. It is live for you to download and take a closer look at. But I think we just want to finish off today with Maureen, Owen, and myself, just spend a little bit of time trying to answer some of the questions that have come in through today's webinar, and try and, we probably won't get to all the questions. I think some of the questions are fairly meaty in terms of the answers, but hopefully we'll try and get some of the questions answered for you. So welcome back, Maureen and Owen.
Hey, hi.
So Maureen, I I'll challenge you on this one. I do apologise. I know who has sent it in, but the question is, you know, because we talk about inflation, and then there's others that will talk about core inflation and the differences between, and this is where we start to think about what influences inflation in the UK. The question is what is your view on the impact of long tail services inflation on the overall inflationary landscape, and how long do you think the long tail could last?
Very interesting, very interesting question. And just to be clear, I take that to be referring to online services like your Amazon and eBay of this world. And what we are seeing with the increased prices, consumers are taking the demand online, buying and purchasing off places like Amazon and eBay, whose business model is they're selling small amounts but of a wide variety of goods. So I take it that's what is meant by the question. But yes, I mean, we have seen the disappearance of bricks and mortar, you know, over the years, and with the inflationary pressures, we see a lot of people going over to the likes of Amazon and eBay to reduce that cost pressure. And of course, what that brings with it is that pressure on prices as well. So I can't say how long this will last, but it will certainly be contributing to inflation. What we do know, the biggest drivers are in food and drinks and energy prices, and we see those are coming down, and so that's reducing inflation. At the pumps, the prices are going up, and that's pushing inflation upwards. But certainly, as people try to reduce the impact of the cost of living crisis and moving to the likes of Amazon and eBay, that's a different cost pressure that will be adding to inflation. How long that lasts and the impact, I don't know. I wish I had a crystal ball, but I do agree that it will be contributing. Just how much, I don't know.
And a slight follow-up to that same topic, and we know that the government did push back their inflation recovery forecast, and it went out to 2025. You know, there's still a view that they believe they will achieve the 5% by the end of this year, which I think is challenged by many of the economists, whether they can get it down to that 5% figure by the end of this year. But do you feel that, you know, the Bank of England have obviously held the last review of the base rate increase? There's still another potential review to come, but do you think we will start to, you think it's a realistic recovery period that you showed earlier of that inflation recovery? I mean, there's still a lot going on, isn't there, in terms of, you know, where that's fuel prices and everything else that's taking place?
Precisely. I mean, I wouldn't put myself forward as you know, having better forecasts than the MPC, but nevertheless, I completely agree with you, because what we are seeing is, even though there are positive signs in some areas, other areas, you know, are, you know, the prices are increasing. So it's very difficult to say. I think it's still very, very uncertain, but there is a commitment to hit that target, and one would hope that the forces will get us there eventually. I mean, it's always a question of how long, and, you know, what happens in the interim. I don't think the geopolitical situations are actually helping. So it's still a lot of uncertainty. But if we are to see interest rates come down, we do need to hit that target.
Thank you. And Owen, on the subject of batteries and battery technology, and, you know, you and I talk a lot about solid state and lithium ion and blade technology and everything that's coming around the corner, and it will lead on to a further question that has come through around residual values. But the question has come in as, when do you think when do you think that solid state batteries will become commercially viable for OEMs to put them in a vehicle in place of lithium ion? And it's quite an interesting one, because this week I think there's been one of the OEMs that, because it's financially better for them to stay with the lithium ion, rather than move into the solid state, because there's some of the challenge of getting the affordability of battery electric vehicles down, but at the same time, lithium, solid state is perceived to be the better proposition for the user of the vehicle.
Yeah. So, John, great question. So what I would say on the back of that is there's two parts to this. The first one is, when will there be the commerciality coming? So the likes of Nissan, Toyota have indicated that 2026 is likely to be the period when they release their solid state batteries. However, is more likely the commerciality fully to put it in vehicles is broadly between 2026 and 2028. So hopefully that answers the question there. In the way of taking lithium out of the battery, in fact, some solid state batteries will still retain lithium. What's the difference between a normal battery as we see now, a lithium battery that we see now, and a solid state battery? It's actually what's known as the electrolyzer, which is the liquid bit in the middle. So putting this into more simplistic terms, you have a positive and you have a negative, and then you have fluid in the middle that the current goes across. Now, the issue around solid state is that liquid will now become solid, and the biggest issue that we're finding at the moment is developing that solid state as it is. So you will still have potentially lithium in it. There are other batteries out there, though, that they could potentially put into some vehicles, such as sodium sulfate, so it has no lithium in at all, and therefore could take the pressure off, as you said, Phil, the high demand for lithium. Hopefully that answers the question.
It does, and connected with that, we had a second question in from Jimmy Malik, who said that will the charge times of solid state batteries be similar to current charging times?
Yeah, again, Jimmy, that's a great question as well. So what I would say around that is there's two factors to consider. One is the battery and the ability for the battery to absorb the charge. That's point number one. So that will change as the battery architecture changes. So at the moment we're 400 volt. That will go to 800 volt, which will allow the batteries to absorb more power. It's the battery to absorb more power through its architecture and the battery itself. In simplistic terms, it's more technical than this. But the thing that's going to potentially hold that back is the ability to use the charging point. So if the charging point is a 22 kilowatt charger, it won't charge it any faster than what a 22 kilowatt will charge it. However, if you ramp up to 350 kilowatt chargers, which is the ultra rapid chargers, which you see at places like GridServe, etc., they will be able to charge these solid state batteries at a faster rate, okay, if the vehicle is 800 volt. We are starting to hear in the wings that there is 600 kilowatt chargers coming. We believe the Chinese are also manufacturing these at the moment. Now, clearly the biggest issue of a 600 kilowatt charger is hugely got a lot of voltage, which has a lot of resistance, which has a lot of heat involved. So, the pipes, they will be pipes that you put to the car, will have to be cool, but they could charge theoretically in 2 to 3 minutes from 0 to or 20% to 80%, which is where most Teslas charge.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is these on the horizon of those 600, 800 kilowatt charging, but I think at the minute trying to find a charger
that works.
The vehicle that will take that charge is going to be the challenge, isn't it, as we look at it today. So you might be able to do it in 20 to 80% in literally 8 minutes if you can find 600 kilowatt charger to be able to do that to your vehicle is going to be the biggest challenge.
So on that, it's battery and the charger, by the way, Phil.
Yeah. So I think staying on that subject before we move on to impact of residual values around all of the things talking about electric vehicles, and David Betterleys has sent a nice one in for you here, Owen. So can you comment on all the unintended consequences of the rush to BEVs, collapsing car parks, fires, brake tyre dust, costs of public charging, and now higher insurance costs? Now, I think David's tried throwing everything into this one. We know that publicly, John Lewis had put out that they were pulling away from insuring battery electric vehicles. There's been other questions around the cost of insuring battery electric vehicles, but clearly we know that the premiums in the last 12 months on insurance in general, not just battery electric vehicles, have increased on average about 36%. But to answer David's question, I mean, what's your thoughts around some of that going forward? Because we see all the videos that are blaming the battery electric vehicle when we see a fire, and subsequently it doesn't turn out to be the case.
Yeah, so thanks for that one, David. Appreciate that. and Phil. Yeah, so there are clearly, with every type of technology, there's consequences. Okay, that's point number one. So battery electric vehicles, do battery electric vehicles go up in flames any more than any other vehicle? The answer is probably no. Okay, it's still very early days, and there's still very limited numbers of battery electric vehicles on the road. So as those battery electric vehicles get older, there may be some form of incident. We don't know, because we don't know on the aging, but there may be increasingly more fires. But there is anyway with internal combustion engines. So most internal combustion engines, when they go up in fire, tends to be down the aging of the car, and the same with battery electric vehicles. So I suppose what you're trying to say there, David, what are these consequences? Well, fire is clearly one of them through thermal runaway. And what that basically is as the battery heats up, it gets to a stage where explosion takes place. One cell in the battery explodes, and then it generates thermal runaway, which then goes on to another cell, and onto another cell. Now, the issue with that versus internal combustion engine is as follows. Thermal runaway can generate up to 1,000 degrees worth of heat, and hence what you have seen in some aspects is where structures, cars just basically disintegrate, and that's the big problem. Now, the other issue is putting those vehicles out. So an internal combustion engine is estimated to have at least 2,500 litres of water to put it out. In order to put a battery electric vehicle, you're more looking at 10,500 litres of water, and you have to sink these batteries and the car, submerge them completely over time. And the conversations we've had with testing centres is actually even after 48 hours, you bring these batteries out, they can then start combusting again. So there is a real risk around the scenario of thermal runaway. The other issues that you've highlighted, collapsing car parks. I'm not sure about the car park itself, but of course, if the heat is very intense from the battery, that could cause a problem. Brake and tyre dust. Yes, there is high levels of brake and tyre dust, but that also is the case for internal combustion engine, more for BEVs. And I think sooner or later, there will be also legislation on battery and tyres. Cost of public charging. The cost of public charging will have to go up, clearly. The UK government is investing in that heavily. They've suggested broadly 300,000 chargers by 2030. So there is not sufficient enough charging at the moment. We know that, and it's possibly not the correct charging either. There's quite a lot of investment into 9, 22 kilowatt chargers, and more needs to be done into the 350 kilowatt chargers. And then to finally finish off, higher insurance costs. Yeah, we are seeing and hearing a lot more that if one of these cars is attached to your house, which is where you would charge it, the insurance of both the car and possibly the house would also rise, as Phil has alluded to. So there are natural consequences for having battery electric vehicles, as there will be for hydrogen, as there will be for e-fuels.
I think part of the insurance is confidence. As we start to develop the repair, maintenance, and recycling, and the development of battery electric vehicles, the insurance companies will slowly get around that and understand the complexities, and that they can be repaired and replaced as easy as other vehicles. So I think this is all about time and evolution as we shift towards this battery electric vehicle market. So just finally, the last question, because we are running out of time and we don't really want to keep anybody longer than we need to. And any questions that we've not answered, then we can get back to you separately, or please, like I said earlier, please do feel free. I think the question came in from Andrew Thompson around talking about the things around play out in terms of residual values on battery electric vehicles. And obviously what we have seen starting in October of last year is significant high level of volume of battery electric vehicles started to re-enter the used vehicle market, the leasing, the opt-out benefit in kind sector, driven primarily by Tesla as the dominant volume. That did have an impact on residual values and the used vehicle battery electric market. But, that has started to stabilize now as people start to see the value of some of these used battery electric vehicles, at the same time as the sector becomes more knowledgeable around how to talk to consumers and drivers of new and used battery electric vehicles. I think one thing for me is just to keep a close eye on what is happening, because, as the conversations there with Owen around some of the technology and developments around battery electric vehicles, and some of these new entrants starting to come into the market, we're not there yet with battery electric vehicles. There is still a lot of evolution, a lot of change coming, entry costs into the battery electric vehicle as some of these new entrants, whether that's China, Vietnam, and other markets, start to come into either the UK or European markets, where suddenly the consumer's choice of vehicles will shift and change and become more affordable entry points. So we've just got to be very careful in terms of that residual value forecast and understand the way the market is shifting. But, you know, we talked about it right at the start. Owen mentioned it, that there's a lot to be done, and that's through conversations, whether it's the UK government, whether it's the European Commission, regulators within the sector, trade associations within the sector, to try and stabilise this volatility of battery electric vehicle values in the used vehicle market. But it is a period of time, because, you know, as we move, the volumes will there, consumer ownership and understanding and confidence will come along with it. So I think, to answer your question, Andrew, I think, you know, there is potential pockets of volatility still to come, but it will start to ease as we understand it going forward. I don't know if you've got anything to add on to that finally, Owen.
Yeah, so the only things I would add is the following. One is the battery chemistry is going to clearly have an impact. You know, people are going to be wanting, you know, 800 volt architecture, which charges my vehicle faster. They're going to be wanting batteries that have longer levels of life and limited less levels of charging, which we've commented around, solid state batteries, etc. So as those different levels of technology take place, that will be happening, and residual values could well jump. Production. So Tesla at the moment can continue to reduce their price if they so wish to increase market share. So be aware of that factor that's out there. We believe they can continue to reduce that even further. And they've done that in the US over the last couple of weeks. They've done that in China. And then, as Phil says, we don't know what's going to happen with the Chinese vehicle manufacturers as they come to the UK. So I just enhance what Phil said.
Well, finally, I mean, thank you initially to Owen and Maureen for joining me today on today's webinar. And I think, I say, there's a lot to cover in the automotive sector at the minute. So hopefully we've given you a brief insight as to what to expect within this year's Insight Report. That is, as I said earlier, available to download. As you can see there on screen at coxautoinc.eu. As I say, if you do share anything through social media channels, then do tag Cox Automotive in and use the hashtag Insight Report 2023. As I say, we will try and get back to you in terms of any questions that we've not managed to answer, or if you do have additional questions, then please do feel free to send them in. There will be a recording of this webinar available for you to watch over or to send to friends and colleagues after today. So that remains to say thank you for joining us today. Please do have a good rest of the day or evening, depending where you are watching us in the world. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot.